Holroyd H. Broadbent of 7578 West Saginaw in Lansing, Michigan, 48917. Ward's phone number is area code 517-627-5665. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River on October 12th, 1990. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Okay, Ward, if you could just start with your name and your address and your phone number, please.
My name is Holroyd Broadbent. I live at 7578 West Saginaw Highway, Lansing. And the phone number is 627-5665.
Okay. Now, if you could just take us back to when you started at Olds and where you were and what you were doing.
Well, actually, that's pretty clear to me that first day.
Okay.
I hired in September 24th, 1935.
All right.
And I was material handler. 48 cents an hour.
Oh, wow.
And that was the best thing that ever happened to me in my entire life, was getting a job at Oldsmobile.
Okay.
And I remember that first day, they put me stenciling mufflers. I could almost tell you the part number. It started with about like 406 340 or something. I had paint. You had a little round brush and a little round can of paint that you added a little water to and mixed it up, just a block of paint. You mix that up and stenciled this on. You cut a stencil with the stencil machine, put this thing on this muffler, and you had to wait a few seconds, set it over on a rack until it dried, and then they'd come and the trucker would move it out. And I worked right through the noon hour. I was so excited at working and having a job that the bell rang and I didn't even know what it was. I was down, they put me down in the basement away from everyone.
Okay.
And there was no one around there, and I just kept right on and going, working, you know, and the guy, the foreman, I think, finally came down there and he said, well, didn't you quit and take a noon hour? And I said, well, I didn't know I was supposed to. I didn't hear anything. He said, the bell rang. I said, I didn't hear anything.
Oh, right.
So that was my introduction to Oldsmobile. I'd give him a day's work that day, and I think I gave him one every day after that. At least I tried to.
Where was that? Do you remember, Ward?
That was in the basement of the building there on what was that building? 62 or 60?
Right. 62. The old
the old parts building down on Olds Avenue at the time, in the basement.
You were in the basement.
They kept all their heavy material, their axle housings and bumper bars and the mufflers were all kept down in the basement. They kind of had the stock segregated that way.
Okay. Well, where did you go through the employment process? Where was that?
That was over on Townsend and Elm Street.
In the administration building?
Yes, in the administration. I tried to get a job. I graduated from high school when I was 17 years old in January, and I wasn't 18 until May. And I couldn't get a job. I was unemployed, and we really had a hard time with it. My dad had died in 29, and we just were struggling, my mother and I. We didn't have any family here because they came from England, and and their families were, my mother had some sisters and a brother, and my dad had a brother in England, but so I had no family other than my mother. And we were having a hard time making ends meet. And that was just, I remember the first paycheck I drew. I got $12.
Oh,
And I took it home and gave it to my mother, and she insisted. I didn't have a coat. I'd been having a hard time. We were poor. She owned her home, but that was about it. And I went downtown to May's department store. There was a place called May's down there in about 200 block of South Washington. And I bought a corduroy coat, three-quarter coat.
Okay.
And then after that, why, I don't remember much about it. I made I made 48 cents an hour for the first 2 weeks, and then I got 54.
Okay.
And I worked at 54 cents an hour for a year. Then they give you a 3-cent raise. In 36, I got a big raise of 3 cents an hour to 57 cents an hour. And I worked for 57 cents an hour for a couple of years, I guess, until union came along, 37, and we started getting kind of nickel raises once in a while.
Okay, so there was no union when you came then,
No.
in 35?
No union.
And now that big unionization effort then happened very shortly after you arrived then?
Yes, I think it was around 37 we started getting nickel raise once in a while, and you thought you'd died and gone to heaven, right? They really, you know, you were making about 21, 22 bucks a week, and I took that home and gave that and turned that over to my mother to run the house, and I had $1 or $2 spending money or something. I thought I was sitting on top of the world, really. But so I was a material handler. They had material handler classifications, and then some of the people in the shipping room were checkers, stock pickers.
Did you have to drive truck or anything, or didn't they have trucks in those days?
Oh yeah, they had finger trucks, the old style with a big handle on.
The kind of the walkie kind that you.
Well, they had hand jacks. They had some power jacks, and they had hand jacks that you just raise it up and down a couple of times, hydraulics, to move pallets around with. But they had finger trucks.
Finger truck.
Oh yes, yeah, they had finger trucks. But it was nothing like they are today. The trucks were entirely different, of course, and they stood up on the trucks. Most of them were stand-ups, gas trucks.
Oh, they were all gas.
I don't recall any battery trucks. And then they put in battery trucks and had a battery station in the basement and a battery attendant that changed the truck's batteries frequently.
Did that gas everybody in the building? When
Oh, sure. Yeah, they didn't worry much about that.
They did.
Yeah. There was no smoking in the basement. The smokers were all sneaking out on the dock or hoping to get a job unloading a boxcar or something, so they'd get a smoke. But I didn't smoke, so it didn't bother me any. But it was a nice place, really a nice place to work, and it was a friendly place to work, and nobody was really driving you or anything like that. It was just a nice place to work, and I was just tickled pink to have a job there.
How did you happen to end up in the warehouse rather than out on production or something like that?
Well, it was one of these deals. I couldn't get a job. I went down there. I was 18 in May, and I went down there, I think, every day. I lived 2 blocks from there. Oh, yeah. I lived on the corner of Chestnut and Williams, just north, a block north of the park. And I went in the employment office. A fellow named Miller was the employment manager, and he was from the South. And it seemed the story was, and there was a lot of truth in it, if you came up from the South, you got a job right away. But I went in there every day. They got to know me. They'd just wave at me and say, nothing today. I just could not get a job. And finally, a lady across the street that knew my mother, her husband worked was a foreman in the machine shop at the parts, pass model machine shop. Frank Rodemeister was his name. And Frank, they were hiring some guys in the fall, and they hired about 25 or 30 when I got in there, young guys. Business was picking up there towards 36 or end of 35. And Frank put in a word to me to Glenn Wakeman, general foreman. And he put my name in there, I guess, because they called me. What was this? Mac, I worked in the personnel department.
Oh, McFarland?
McFarland. Yeah. He lived about 4 or 5 doors up the street from me on Chestnut Street, and I remember he came one day, and I was just going out the back door. I was going to walk over. I didn't have a car, of course. I had to walk over to Motor Wheel, which is about 5 miles. Yeah. I was going over there and see if I could put my application. I had it every place,
Yeah.
in the Rio and every place,
Yeah.
factories mostly. And he came at the front door. My mother came out. I was going down the street out the back door, and she hollered it was somebody to see me there. And I went up. It was McFarland, and he said to report over at the Oldsmobile. They were going to give me a job. Well,
Okay.
boy, talk about tickled.
Yeah, I can imagine,
Yeah, that was a big deal getting the job. That was the best place to work in Lansing.
It was.
Oldsmobile.
It was just, that was what
It
people
really
thought.
was, yeah. So I worked in there, and I became a stock picker, and then I became a trim shop attendant. We had our own, about 39, I guess, 38 or 39, I went in the trim shop.
Yeah, what
And they had an upholstery, their own upholstery department up
okay.
there. You made seat backs out of the cloth
Yeah.
on seat backs and seats and side panels and
Oh.
headlinings. They had
We
sewing
actually made
machines.
those?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah. They'd had that machine. They'd had that shop for quite a long time.
Okay.
In fact, I think they had it when I hired in,
Uh-huh.
but I didn't have an opportunity to get in there
Sure.
until about 38, something like that.
Yeah.
And that was a good job. A fellow named Cyrus Lynn, Ike Lynn, was the foreman. Little short fella, probably weighed about 150 pounds, and he had the strongest grip of any man that I ever knew in my entire life. If he caught you sitting on a bench like a noon hour, you're
Yeah.
sitting on the table waiting for noon, he'd come along, and boy, everybody piled off of those benches when they saw him coming. He'd grab you right in the leg here, above the knee, and just talk to you with a smile on his face, and you just could not stand it. Oh, tremendous strength. There wasn't anybody. They had a guy about 6'2" and weighed about 230 from Shalott, a big farmer, and he wouldn't have anything to do with Ike.
Really?
I saw Ike Ike, that was his nickname. I could go up and say, "Hey, Art," and he'd get him to shake hands for Art thing. And he'd just smile and talk to him, and he's putting the pressure on all the time, and he'd put Ike right there, Art right down on his knees.
I'll be darned.
Tremendous. I don't know how. They always attributed that to pulling, stretching leather leather tops over automobiles, but I think he was just naturally tremendously strong. God, it was something else. Well, anyway, to get back to my job, I guess, I worked up there as a trim attendant, they called it. And we built cushions, and we tear the top on a leather top on a station wagon, unloading it over there at the Fisher, where the Fisher trucks came in and unload it in the final. They'd tear a top once in a while, and we'd put on a new top and leather top. So I worked there till about 41, and then the war had come along by then, and all the guys, we were getting 5 days a week in the parts, and everybody was working 6 and 7 days in gun plants and that. So gradually all the younger fellows left the parts, and I was one of them. I went over and I worked in a breech ring, 75 millimeter breech ring, for Bill Freeman.
Oh, okay.
Bill Freeman later became superintendent of pressed metals and whatnot over there.
Was that down in that area in the building?
No, it was right straight across one of these newer plants over there, where the engine plant was, the old 8 engine plant, and that rocket engine plant. I think that rocket engine plant became the gun plant became the rocket engine plant there. It was just up from Elm Street there on the south side. And we were working on breech rings, 75 millimeter breech ring. I was a machine operator, had a drilling machine operation. You had a hoist. These breech rings were about as big as a 50-pound block of ice, and they were heavy. And you'd hoist them up with a power hoist and bring it over to your machine, set it in. You had a drilling machine, and maybe take it out and turn it and drill some more. You had a series of machines in there that did a series of operations along the line. About 10 different drill machines and broaches and doing, I don't recall, shaper probably. Something.
All single-purpose kind of machines.
Yes.
Single drill.
Well, they had multiple drills coming in. Oh yeah, they were pretty well automated. A roller conveyor, it just pushed it along on a roller conveyor, so they didn't pile up or anything.
So one guy would do his thing
and
roll it on down to the next
stick it back on the roller and go on to the next one. Then they'd had a finished breech ring when they finished, and they were building the tubes, the barrels in that same building. Del McRae was the assistant superintendent in there. And I can't think of the superintendent's name. might come to me sometime, but not
Okay.
today
No
anyway.
problem.
So Bill Freeman took an interest in me there and seemed to think that I could do better if, you know, it was the first time anybody that I'd really thought about doing anything other than what somebody told me to do. He tried to get me a job in the drafting, and I had to go up for an interview and whatnot, but that didn't work out. And Bill was extremely good to me in that sense, although I think on my side I was a pretty good worker, and he needed a swing man. They were working 6 days a week, and you had a different day each week.
Oh.
And he had a crew there, and he wanted somebody that would take the time and learn all the machines.
Okay.
And he couldn't get anyone. Nobody, the older ones would do it.
Yeah.
So he asked me. I said, sure, I'll try it.
Okay.
So I learned all the machines. I became his swing man.
So how did you then working 5 or 7 days in a row, or how
That
did
was
you do that?
then Bill told me that job didn't work out, and he really was good to me and started me, in all honesty, on thinking about there might be more to just take whatever job they did. I didn't even know about transferring. I just hired in at the parts and thought that would be there the rest. So he told me that there was a job openings in the tool and die room for Vic Forrester.
All right.
So I went down and interviewed and applied for a job, and Vic hired me. He was the superintendent there, and Larry Ginther was the general foreman.
Oh, yeah.
A fellow named Bert Chittington and Roy Ladow were the two foremen on it. They had 3-shift operation.
Right.
You worked 7 days a week, because Vic says, can you work 7 days a week? Yes, sir. And he says, well, you don't get days off. And I said, that's all right. So I started on there as on a Brown and Sharp grinder, surface grinder. And I was on that for 2 years. And that was, it was tough work. It was, you know, you'd have plus or minus 2/10,000ths on these gauges. The government had strict standards on all these gauges and that. And we were grinding dies and tools and gauges and whatnot. And I worked 7 days a week for almost 2 years, and I had a week off each year.
A whole week.
A whole week
Wow.
each year. And that's why I was never very tolerant after later on in life when I became a supervisor and that, about people that would work 2 or 3 Saturdays in a row and then feel they had to have time off because they were working so much. And because that 7 days a week was extremely difficult because it was a swing shift.
Okay.
You worked days, and then you went home every 4th Sunday and came back at 12 o'clock that night and did a 16-hour deal there, did another 8 hours, starting on the next shift, on the night shift. And you come off on nights and go home and on the 4th Monday, come in on the afternoon, and you were on afternoons. So those machines never stopped. You got in there early, about 20 minutes, say, to 12 on the midnight shift, so you could find out what the guy on the shift ahead of you had set up. He might have a very intricate job with compound angles and every other thing that they were anxious to get, and he wanted to show you where he was on that job. So you just came in early, and
that was just kind of an accepted fact?
Yeah, it was what they used to call later on salary, a little casual overtime, but you didn't think anything of it. I mean, it was part of the job. And if a guy was late getting in, you'd just stay over for a half hour or something.
Out, so to speak.
Yeah, and work until we got there, unless he called in and wasn't coming in. So I worked a variety of machines, all grinders. I was in a grinder group, and I really enjoyed that work. And then we went to school several days a week. A man named Mr. Hudson. Guy Hudson. A real fine gentleman. I'd see him yet there. And we learned, I'd had geometry in school, but we went over, had a class in geometry, and then we got into trigonometry, and you had blueprint reading, which I was familiar with. I'd taken a couple of years of drafting in school. And that was really interesting. I thought at that point, my goal was to be a tool and die maker.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
My father had been a tool and die maker, and I thought that was pretty anything he did was pretty nice, I thought. And I'd have been real happy to have been in there, worked in the tool room, die room. But I got drafted. I had a deferment for 6 months. I was 3A with my mother at the start of the war, which kept me out of the service.
Yeah.
And then I was in the gun plant, in the die room, and they gave me a 6 months deferment.
Okay.
When that ran out, the Army took me and put me in the MPs, military police. I was in the Army 3 years.
When that was from like when 40?
From 43 to 46.
Okay, 43.
Yeah, I went I think in August 43 and got out in March 46. And I didn't go overseas. I was just, they put me in a limited service group. I couldn't see across the street without my glasses on. You know, I was about the least likely candidate you would think to go in the Army, but it wasn't that bad a deal. I kind of enjoyed it after I got in. We had a good bunch, good outfit I was in. And I never left the States, but I was up at Sault Ste. Marie for a year, and I was in Illinois, and I was in Wisconsin camps, and then I had 2 years in California, which was a pretty good deal.
So when you came back, then was the plant working again?
The plant was on strike when I came back, and I had visions of drawing $25 a week, you know, for about 6 months while I could lay around and that. And I came back on Tuesday, and the plant went back to work on Wednesday.
Oh, no.
So I had to go down and report in and go to work. So I never lost a day, and I was never laid off a day in 40 years. I never was laid off a day in the factory.
Even during that period in the 30s, the late 30s, when things were kind of...
We went to 3 days a week, or 4 days a week. They were going to start at 4 days a week, 1 week, and 3 days the next or something, kind of alternate for people. And we went to 4 days 1 week, and then that only lasted 1 week, I think, and went back to 5 days a week. And after that, and I never lost it. I was never laid off a day. And production was down all summer in those days. The kids, I was 18, 19, 20 years old then, and all the other fellows, young fellows, I was unmarried, was all hanging around the Scott Park down there in town. They had tennis courts and softball, and I was into softball pretty heavy. I played with the Oldsmobile softball team that in 35 they won the state championship.
Now, who did they play, Lord?
Who
did like that kind of a team? What kind of other teams did they play?
Well, I was pitching Double A. They had A and Double A and Triple A, and they had Triple A was Oldsmobile. That was your top softball teams, and it was really hot in the 30s. Things were tough. People went to softball games. It was free. It was nothing to have 5,000 to 6,000 people.
No kidding.
Really?
At a game like that?
Yeah, they'd be lined up all the way around the outfield. Amazing. They'd even have ground double rules on some fields. On one field, the ground rule double if you hit into the crowd. They were just rabid. And Oldsmobile won the state championship, which they played in the state amateur softball association, and they played teams from all over the state. They'd work in their districts. Then the district's champions would get together and play, and finally on Labor Day you'd work it out after playing maybe 8 or 9, 10 games against different district champions. You'd be regional champions would come down, you know, just kind of
Were those all generally industrial kinds of teams, or were they...
Well, Buick, Midland had a team up there that the Dow Chemical Companies had teams. Briggs Beauty Wear had teams. They were both Midland and Dow Chemical and Briggs Beauty Wear won. Briggs Beauty Wear won the World's Championship, and I think Midland played for the World's Champion. I don't remember when they won. And Midland had picked up some fellas from Lansing, the fellas that I knew that they'd recruited and moved up to Midland.
Did these guys all have to work for Oldsmobile?
No.
The Oldsmobile team?
No. Two-thirds of them did. Well, they picked me up, like signed me out of the minors, so to speak, in Double A in 36. So I played with them in 36, and then I think 36, 37, and then Oldsmobile dropped their team.
They did?
And I don't recall, probably a change in administration down there or something. They got out of the team because it was a good sponsor, you know, new uniforms. And
So really,
shoes.
Olds was basically the sponsor for the organization and provided some of the players.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Okay.
it was necessary. A fellow that was a foreman over there, Al Niles, managed the team. And Herm Hinchy, I think they had a girls team. And Hinchy, Irvin Hinchy, who became personnel director for Fisher Body Lansing, he was the manager of that team.
Okay.
So we got into softball. And then how did I get into softball?
Well, I don't know. Well, that's an interesting thing because
I guess thinking about the Oldsmobile
yeah,
team.
I got a lot of pictures in the file of softball teams and never quite figured out how that all related. So I thought maybe we provided all the people and they had to work at Olds, but they didn't. So.
No, there was no requirement of that, although there were a lot of Oldsmobile players on it.
Did Rio, for example, have did they?
Rio was in the athletics for a while, but then later, about that time, they didn't have a team in there.
And Motor Wheel and those kinds of things?
Motor Wheel, yeah, they had a team at one time. There were quite a few of the industrials.
But would you play people like, you wouldn't play people like Michigan State, would you?
Oh, no. No, and then later on, after first year, I think, Oldsmobile and that, then they formed a kind of a semi-pro league around Lansing, around the state. Yeah. They had a strong association, Michigan Association softball. And we played every Saturday night, you played away. We played against Buick over at Flint. Yeah. Buick had a team for a while. And then the St. Joe Auto Specialties. They used to build the jacks and some other things for Oldsmobile and other companies, car jacks and that. They got up and they went into it. Both Midland, Dow Chemical, and the St. Joe Auto Specialties went into it. They built a field right on their own property.
Really?
Grandstand, had the lights, big lights up there, you know. And they recruited these guys from all over. Yeah. And they go to these world or United States tournaments where the state champions came. Yeah. They'd find a pitcher down in Arkansas and they'd hire him, bring him up, put him working all this. So it got kind of semi-pro.
Yeah. Where did you guys play? Here in town?
They formed, in order to get two teams in town, they had one team, and that was Lorenz Brothers, I think, or the Lansing team played at Lansing, and we had to go over and play in we represented Grand Ledge at the time. Okay. And then they went to Heatherwood Farms. After we lost the Oldsmobile sponsorship, we became Heatherwood Farms. Okay. Played with Heatherwood Farms for a few years. And then we split up, and they said the four top pitchers, the city association, in order to get so teams couldn't load up. Yeah. You know, some were better sponsors than others. Sure. They'd load up that the four top pitchers in the city had to be on different teams. Well, I was one of those four. Archie Tarpoff, and I forget who the other two were, the four top pitchers. So Gail Retzloff and I split off, and we had a nucleus of guys there that we took, and we got a sponsor from Knee High Beverages here in town. Okay. And we played for Knee High for a couple of years. All right. Then I went with King's Clothes. Oh, you go and that, and this semi-pro deal on Saturday nights where you had to go to Flint or Grand Rapids or Jackson or someplace. That kind of died.
Did you get paid for any of that?
We got $2.
$2?
$2 for playing. And the guy, and $3 gas money, I guess. Whoever drove the car got $5. He got $3 gas money. It was just for fun. Oh yeah. But it was hot town, and they were giving pretty good write-ups in the paper. I got a lot of clippings at home.
Where were the ball fields themselves, the actual fields?
Well, they were city. They were all city-owned. Elm Street had a field, Elm Street Field. Ranny Park had a nice field. They put a lot of money into keeping that. That park was just like this ball dam there. So it was hot. Softball was really hot. I don't think it ever was as hot again after it got into the 30s. And when the war came along, that kind of knocked it out. I went in the service. When I came back, I didn't know anybody then. I'd been gone 3 years, and I caught on with a AA team, played 1 year, and then quit.
While we're in the 30s, what do you remember about the big old sit-down strike, Ward? What happened? At least
we worked we worked right through the strike.
So it didn't even affect you?
Didn't affect us. No. Not on that. We didn't. I don't recall Oldsmobile having anybody sitting down in Olds. They didn't take over any buildings or anything like they did in Detroit when Walter Reuther took that over.
But you must have had a walkout. People must have left the plant, didn't they?
Well, not in the parts. I never lost a day. I worked all the time. Never was laid off a day. Never drew a nickel's worth of unemployment or whatever, $16 a week it was. I was making 20 working, and these buddies of mine there in the early 30s were making $16 a week and playing softball and tennis all day long. That kind of bothered me a little bit, but I needed the money, so. But it was only $4 there. I was working for $4 a week. Yeah, but that worked out all right.
After the union, after that 37 or 36 thing in union, did everybody have to join the union after that, or?
Yes, became compulsory then, and then they made a deduction from your paycheck on that. Maybe, I don't think right at the start, but shortly after that they agreed to deduct that. Up until then, you know, that first 3 or 4 years I worked at $1.23 out once a month for insurance. That was the only deduction you had on your check. Boy, you ought to hear the guys yell when that $1.23 came around. They'd kind of forget it was due, and holy smoke, they took insurance out. They got $1.23. Well, that was about 2.5 hours pay.
Boy, that was a lot of money.
Took out. But looking back on it, or looking at it is today with the deductions and the Social Security tax and your insurance and what have you, that $1.23 was pretty slim. You had $2,000 life insurance, I think, along with that. Well, that's what it was. There was.
Okay, you had a toolbox.
I bought a toolbox. I had my dad's toolbox, and his toolbox was about 18 inches long and about 1 foot wide, foot high, and about 12 foot deep. And he'd worked 30 years as a tool and die maker out of that toolbox, but that wasn't big enough for me. All the guys bought these Kennedy boxes. They were a larger box. They came up about this high, metal box, top lifted up and the front drop down, slid under all your drawers. And of course, I had to have a Kennedy box, and I had sign bars that I'd made. In fact, the foremen were always coming over having you make these government jobs, and they'd get these sign bars made and hardened, and then they'd bring them over, and you had to grind them within about 1 or 2 10,000ths. You know, it was a government job there that you'd fit in on there. So I had those and angle plates and squares and whatnot, you know, that you'd made. So I had a full toolbox and that. So, and I couldn't get back in there. They had reduced all that, and later I guess people went back in, but later on I wasn't interested because I went to work in cash sales at the parts. I was a counterman. A fellow in there, Russ Willis was in there, and a fellow named Floyd Bullock was in there. And Floyd went up to the office, and that left Russ, and they came and asked me, Glenn Wakeman, the general foreman, asked me if I'd like to go down there. That was, I made another 3 cents an hour, I think, down there.
That was an hourly job still?
Yeah, hourly job. And later went to be a clerk. About 8 years later, they made salary clerks out of it.
Oh.
But at that time, it was hourly job. I think I made $1.75 an hour at that time.
And let's see, that was down at the west end of the building?
Yeah.
On the kind of
a little counter, a little office right there. They had to go through a plant protection man right there, walked right off the street, just this side of the engineering building, just east of the engineering building, right in that end. And the two of us in there, and they sold parts to employees.
Okay. Is that all you sold them to, was just employees?
Oh, no. Anybody could come in. All employees got 25% discount on anything they bought. Yeah. And the dealers could come in there, and the dealers could pick up, and on a charge, we make out a different bill for a dealer. Yeah. And the dealer went on to a different form. And he could come in there, and he got dealer net, which was about 40%, 30 or 40% off of list. So we did a tremendous business. At one time, we had 5 people working in there.
Wow. So you would actually run down the parts for him and bring them
We
back?
had to run down physically, take the order and scoot down there and walk down there. And then when we got real busy, we had some people that they sent down there that just did the running.
Oh, yeah.
Russ and I took the orders and wrote up and dealt with the people, and they did the orders. But then when the work dropped down, Russ and I, and he was the same classification as I was, but I always felt that he was I deferred to him on all decisions. He knew a heck of a lot more about parts than I did, and he'd been there longer than I had and was older than I, so I always felt that he was the boss.
Sure.
But we took turns running. You'd take, if you happened to wait on a guy and there was something out, but you get a guy, you had to go up on the third floor and carry a fender down, and then he wanted an axle shaft out of the basement, go to the basement. Then you'd come back and write him all up, and he'd say, oh, say, he said, I think I didn't get the screws to bolts and nuts. I think I'll have, give me the bolts and nuts and washers for that. So then you had to turn around, go all the way back where you'd been before. It was a lot of work, and so I worked there for 2 years, and Floyd had gone up to the office, Floyd Bullock, and he and I were pretty good friends, and he got a job in purchasing. He was a go-getter, Floyd Bullock. He ended up in engineering over there, in purchasing and engineering. And Floyd was a go-getter. He had more get up and go than anybody I knew. He was into everything, selling raffle tickets, and you've seen fellows like that. Really entrepreneur, I guess. He would have been an entrepreneur if he'd have had $1 million to spend. And Floyd went to purchasing, which is a better job, so he recommended to Ken Mix, who was a parts manager at the time, that I'd be a good man on that material control job in the office. Well, once before, Ken Mix had asked me if I was interested in the salary job, but in all honesty they were making about $140 a month up there at one time when I was working hourly back there this was in 37, and I was making more money than guys working in the office. We were getting overtime in 30s, and I remembered that, and he came along and wanted to know if I was interested in the job, and I said no. Well, it was purely financial with me at that point. They got no overtime in the office, and they were very poorly paid. Those 4-level clerks, very poorly paid. So anyway, I thought, boy, carrying these fenders and that. I was married in 46. I didn't get married till I was almost 30, because I really couldn't prior to that. And I still was taking care of my mother, but I was making more money, and I could see where I could handle it. So anyway, I was married, and I thought, well, I don't want to be doing this. I think I had one youngster in 40, one girl was born in 48. I thought, I got to think of somebody besides myself. That was a nice soft job then, but still, you can't just sit in your tail. So I took the job, and I went up there for $275 a month. They paid us material control work, and it was a nice job, easy job. I thought I'd never learn the damn thing, but I finally did. And after I learned it, I could do the work in about 4 days. That you had just they had the girls in the office, your sales, your disbursements, and your receivables were posted on a big yellow card, and you had 2 boxes of these yellow cards that you sat and thumbed through, and you looked to see that you had orders out to cover your sales, and maybe a big sale, and you'd have to check it out and maybe put in an alteration notice in the purchasing department to move up a shipment date, an order date. So it was an interesting work, and you had your own 2 boxes of cards, and that's all. So it wasn't very long before I could do that job in about 4 days. And then I could settle down kind of and really study the thing and that. And I owe a lot to Ken Mix, because I remember he came down and he told Floyd Bullock that, he said, Ward doesn't want a job there. He said, I asked him once before, he doesn't want it. And Floyd had prompted me on this, and he said, oh, I know you'll take it. He said, I'm sure you'll take it. So he came down and asked me, and he got a kick out of this afterwards. He says, how would you like an office job? I says, fine, I'll take it. And he looked at me, he said, you're the same guy that I asked before? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, what changed your mind? I said, I think I better get off of this job and get doing something better with more opportunity. And he says, okay. So he sent me right over to Matt Campbell to take one of those interview tests or whatever. Yeah. And I went to work up there, and I was paid $275 a month, no overtime. And I know a guy downstairs that worked as a stock picker, a friend of mine. He made that at the end of that year. I made $3,400, and Al was his name. He made $4,200 just picking stock. So you didn't. It wasn't a big. The opportunity was there, but you didn't make any money. I'll tell you that. So in I think 50 or 40 in 1950, they made me a foreman.
Okay.
And
now, was that once again they came to you, or had you?
Well, no, I never said anything. You didn't really do that in those days. Now, after later on in years, I've had lots of people come to me, and hourly workers. Well, I'd like to be a foreman. But in those days, I don't know. There was a little different feeling. You didn't go ask for a job. You had to kind of wait for it to come to you.
Okay.
And so he'd asked me, and I said, sure. So I'll tell you how it went. There was a guy on sick leave. Ike Lynn was a foreman of the trim shop. The trim shop had disappeared. Of course, they had all moved to Fisher Service in Detroit.
All right.
They took the whole thing over.
Oh, they took it away from us.
Yeah, they took it away from us.
When did that happen?
Well, I think it happened during right after the war.
Okay.
Something right after the war, they took that away from us. Took all the trim. Moved all the cloth out, and the cloth and the patterns. We had cutting tables and sewing machines. Moved the whole thing out. Okay. And so Ike was, then he was foreman. They put him over on in Building 16. They were expanding then. The parts were starting to move and build and get in bigger place. And they'd give him some room in the old 16 over there for a bumper store, a bumper and fender store. And Ike was on sick leave, and he said, you want to go over and take Cyrus Lynn, I should say, was on sick leave, and you want to take Lynn's place. And he said, now, we're not going to pay any more money, but it'll give you, really, you couldn't do that today, but it'll give you an opportunity to see what kind of a job you can do, show us what kind you can do. So I went over, and I worked 3 months as a foreman. I think it was pretty close to 2 or 3 months at the time. I kind of forget now. Over there in that fender job, and then Ike came back, and I came back to the parts. There was no change in classification or anything else. It was just went, and I gave them a chance to see what I could do.
What were they doing out there in 16?
They were wrapping fenders, fender storage. They'd move fenders out of the press plant, past model fenders, and some current model. Moved those over into the storage building in 16, and we wrapped them with paper. They had a buck, a wood buck, just a X-frame there like a saw. A buck you'd saw logs on or something and set up, and it was built to hold a fender, and they'd put a fender on, and they'd take a sheet of paper, corrugated paper, a little padding on around. They had string, and they'd wrap that, tie that. They had a certain way of wrapping it around, tying it on. And then they'd store them there, and then when they had orders for them, they'd come over and get them and ship them by truck. It was very costly and wasteful because you had to keep moving the fenders out and bringing them over to the main plant for shipping.
So all of the orders for fenders that would have come out of Building 62 would have come over to Building 16, and then you had to ship them over there to get shipped out.
Yeah, we had to bring them from 16. We had some fenders in the warehouse, and then gradually all the fenders went over there because we had too much stock. We had too many adding parts or adding car classifications and 88s and 98s and 66s and what have you, and they had different parts. So the parts business was growing. There were probably, I would guess, maybe 150 people working in the parts when I hired in, and it was getting up to 300, and it was getting bigger. And so then in 50, I think it was, I got a chance as a foreman. And I worked in Ken Mix was kind of my guiding light there, or whatever you want to call it. He'd take an interest in me and could see things in me, I guess, that I didn't see myself. And he moved me around. He made a point of moving me. I've worked in every department in the warehouse before I really was even general foreman. I'd worked place, and I probably knew the warehouse as well as anyone because I worked in the storage areas and I'd worked in the shipping room and receiving room, and so in 1955 or 55 I think it was. I don't remember, 54, 53, 54, 55. A fellow named Stanley Sussex was office supervisor of the office up there. And a fellow named Miles Church used to be office manager, they called him. And Miles Church had retired, I think. And Stanley Sussex had a heart attack on the way home from one of those football games at Oldsmobile.
Sure.
Gives you tickets and you have your lunch at the Civic Center. And Stanley died driving home from the game, and that job opened up, and so Ken Mix promoted me to office manager.
Huh?
So I came out of the plant then.
And were you still just a foreman on the plant, or were you a general foreman?
I was foreman.
Foreman, okay.
So I got a raise. I think that was a 6 level. The parts foreman were 5 levels in those days.
Okay.
Production foreman were 6.
Gotcha.
But this office manager job was a 6 level. So I went up and was office manager there. And then we moved out of the building in '59, in which you had a bigger part in that move than I did, I think. Yeah. So we moved out in '59 and over there, and I think right shortly after that, I'd been there about a year or so in '50, and a general foreman's job opened up, and they made me general foreman.
Okay.
So then I still kept the office. That was part of. They didn't.
You had both of those.
They didn't.
Foreman job and office.
Yeah, they didn't change. They didn't create another office supervisor.
Okay.
I had everything from the center wall south.
Oh, wow.
South of center wall. I had the M area there, the basket area, the picking area. I had the
sheet iron.
I had the shipping room, the receiving room, and sheet metal in the office. So I had damn near the building, really.
Yeah, sure did.
The other side of the building, Norm Schulteis had the unitizing department, and Jim Werner had the other half of the building in the storage areas. But prior to moving into that building, of course, we had a storage area in Hugh Lyons. Okay. We had storage area in the Rio. In fact, I was foreman over there for a year or so in the Rio. We had storage area in Grand Rapids.
Where was the place in Grand Rapids?
I was never down there. I never knew where that was. It was, I don't think it was on the edge, outskirts there someplace, some warehouse he'd rented.
How had we gotten into those places? Any background on that?
Just didn't have room. Just didn't have any room. We had, and they were purchasing, and that was always a sore point with anyone that had anything to do with the warehouse. The material control department would make long-term buys, lifetime buys. Okay. Fisher Body kind of squeezed them. They'd say, oh, we can't set the dies up again. You have to make a lifetime buy. Oh. Well, maybe you'd sold 400,000 88s that year, and you're making a lifetime buy on left rear quarter panels. Well, they'd buy 10,000 of them. Some seemed like no place to put them. Yeah. They'd come in, and you'd say, gee, do we have to have that? You know, you're practically setting them outside.
So they would give you the number that you had to have. You didn't have much say about
We
that.
never had any say at all on what the material control department handled that. Now, we used to have our own material control. Yeah. That's what
you were doing, wasn't it?
Yeah, in 1948, I was material control clerk. Okay. So then they took the material control right away and put that over into material control with production. Oh, yeah. Okay. And more or less, they kept it as a separate group, I guess. But it was in this. Mike Boughton was the director of that material control group, and they made these lifetime buys. Well, you just couldn't handle it. And fenders, they didn't make lifetime buys on fenders, but they wanted you to take all you could handle at the end of the run if they were changing dies. So you had a tremendous amount of material with no place to put it. So it was a big problem.
That's how we ran out of room.
I used to complain even in GMPD, but I was a voice in the wilderness, and I suppose I still would be. They're probably still buying it, although I think they got into direct shipments on a lot of things. They started making these suppliers like Delco or AC, where you'd buy 200,000 or 300,000 oil filters at a time, And then they started making those plants ship to warehouses direct, instead of shipping into us, and we'd store them all in there and then ship them out again in the weeks to come in the future. So I think they got into a lot more. And of course, you probably know a lot more about it than I do, because you worked later then where they got into these suppliers having them making shipments more as the production schedules called for, rather than just ship the first of the month, send 20,000 something into you that you're going to use in the next 2 months or something. So space was a big problem. We had material stored outside in the yard, bumper bars and anything that we'd paint, those elephant ears, you'd call them, those inner panels, inner fender panels and that, you'd paint those and put some of those outside, try to cover them with plastic or whatnot. But
in the early days, Ward, did we have everything stored here in Lansing, or did we have warehouses?
No, we never had anything. We even had the frames. You know the way they used to get a frame when I first hired in? They'd stand these frames, and they were big frames. They'd stand them up. They had a rack out in the yard, right outside, right beside the building 60s parking lot, right outside the parts warehouse, and they'd stand these frames. You only had 10 or 15 of them out there, and there'd be 6 or 8 of each frame. And the foreman would come down there and he'd yell down through the stock room, "Frames!" He'd holler, "Come on, boys, got to get frames." You know, it'd be about 10 below zero there in January, and they're covered with snow, and you put your hat and coat on and go out, and you took them down by hand.
Manhandle?
Manhandle them. You'd get 2 or 3 guys on a side, and maybe a 2 before bracing them and kind of ease them out, pull them out away there, you know, and take them, put them on a dolly and carry them in. You'd have to get 2 or 3 frames sometimes a day.
Isn't that?
Go out once a day maybe for frames, and then they'd run them. Everything was manhandled on that. And that they didn't have any power or anything to handle them. Then they stood them up rather than they weren't laid down. It was a purely a hand.
When you had heavy things like that, and you were like a local guy was coming in to pick up a heavy part like a cylinder block, didn't you have a way of loading it down?
Well, we had a truck would put cylinder blocks, or you get a jack, they call it. They had a little, and they had a battery operated jack that ran around. You could run it forward or backwards, and it raised up and down. You could run it under. They'd try to store cylinder blocks in short engines. They sold a lot of short engines. After the war, they sold thousands of those short engines, 6s and 8s. They had the camshafts in. The camshaft was in there, and the pistons,
and the crank,
and that was it. And boy, I know. And when I went into cash sales down there after the war, they practically were rebuilding all the Oldsmobiles in the country, especially the front ends. The 37s were very popular. That was a big year. 37 was a big year on cars. And there were a lot of 37s were wearing out pretty well after the war. They'd come in for all those front end assemblies, and after a while in cash sales, you knew all the parts without looking them up. Guy come in, he needed the front end assembly. Oh, he says, I want this spring shackles, and I want this, and I want that. And yeah, we got it. We give him the whole thing. We knew without even looking it up what he wanted. And they sold thousands of those short motors.
Do you remember, when you're this a little off the subject, but in cash sales, did you ever sell any like parts for ancient old Oldsmobiles, that curved dashes and that kind of stuff? Did they still have parts for those things?
They were, some parts that went back. They were carryover parts.
Oh, okay.
But the parts that were characteristic or only with that particular model, why they grabbed, but they kept them a long time. They kept them long, and then they got more realistic on a lot of that, and they didn't keep. And they got so they cut down on it. And then they duplicated things. They carry over bolts and nuts and that. You didn't get into that. Inventories were terrible in those early days. They were hand counted. You'd hand count gun loads of material. And even they wanted even a bag of bolts and nuts or a bag of nuts counted. You know, a guy'd sit there and count those. We'd work till they put two 10-hour shifts on. I know, and we'd work till 4 o'clock in the morning, I think. And on inventory, 10 hours. Come in about, they worked 10 during the day, and they had a little hour noon there or whatnot, and or something like that. But I remember it was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the night shift, and I was on that. They made boards that went across the bins, and you'd stick a board in there, and the guys would wrap rags around and make a seat on it. Sit up there and the board up about 8 feet high, counting screws and bolts, and it was a terrible job. And then they got into scales. The scale company probably got into it, and we'd order a couple of 100 scales, maybe 100 scales would come in, and you'd scale count everything, and that worked out good. And they get big scales in, you'd scale count a whole gun of
great big container
camshafts or anything like that, a couple of 1,000 pounds. You know, you'd weigh them out, you could get them right to within a piece. They got realistic. In later years, material control got realistic. They had the idea, I guess, that they had to keep everything, but Fisher body parts and that, they kind of set up a formula. They'd only keep them so many years, and then you'd scrap them. The scrap programs got more realistic with the inventory.
When we scrapped out parts, did we just throw them away, or did we sell them to somebody?
No, you'd throw them away. I don't recall ever selling anything.
You never sold a big batch of that kind of stuff to people?
No. They just dump it.
You had a machine shop, a pass-mile machine shop, did you?
It was over in the basement of 64. Is that 64, the engineering building?
Yeah.
It was in the basement over there, and they had probably 25 employees over there, all with machines, doing machining on pass-model parts.
All right.
And they'd get the castings in.
What kinds of things could you make over there? Could you make a cylinder block?
No, they didn't do blocks. It was smaller parts, spindles, front ends, wheel spindles, and I can't really think of. I never worked over there, but it was anything that they would normally machine in the motor plant. I would think. And mostly all motor parts. They didn't do body parts or anything. Mostly all machining and pass model parts. I suppose. Piston, axles and whatnot, anything that needed machining. They get castings and they did it. That's where this Frank Rodemeister was general foreman. That's what he was over there in the pass model machine shop.
How long did that stay going, that we did those kinds of things?
Oh, golly, that must have been in there for, I kind of lost track of it. Probably it was in there until the early 40s.
Okay. Because it didn't go to the new building. It wasn't in existence when we moved out.
No, they took that over. They did away with that entirely in production. I think production took that over, or it went to suppliers.
All right.
Maybe they didn't feel that way they could pay to keep those people, or maybe the work got down to where they couldn't do it. And they went out, farmed it out, I suppose, some of it. Pass model that the production didn't want. But
okay, so we moved the whole mess, so to speak, out to the new building. See, prior to then, were fenders and sheet metal parts painted when we sold them, or how did we?
Well, yes, we had a paint shop too in the original parts.
Okay.
Down at the west end of the building on the 3rd floor. That he had about it was probably about 3 bays wide and a couple of bays deep. There, fella. Had one painter in there, Emil Rost. Roost.
Yeah.
R-O-S-T. R-O-S-T. Emil. I used to go up there. They'd send me up there once in a while to help Emil. If he had a lot of turret tops, he used to spray some of them when they'd come in.
All right.
Emil sprayed those quarter panels and tops before they went into storage.
Okay.
He'd run them through the paint shop.
Would you color paint them or just prime paint?
Just prime.
Prime paint.
Brown prime. And if they had a color order, Emil would paint a colored fender.
Oh, you would?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, he'd paint whatever he wanted.
All right.
Up there. Emil was the lord and master of the paint shop. He was the only painter he was the highest paid guy in the building.
I'll be darned.
Made more money than anyone else.
Okay.
And he was a hard worker. All these guys in those days, looking back at it, were very earnest about their work. They were very proud of the jobs they did. You know, it had to be just right. And you go up and help him, and the helper would do was lift things up for him and help him position things and that sort of thing. But boy, you had to do it just the way Amo told you to do it.
Yeah.
You know, but he was a nice guy to get along with.
Can you kind of describe what was where in Building 62 in those early days? Like what
Well,
was
they had in the main floor of 62.
That's the middle floor.
The basement.
The basement.
The basement. The basement, on the east end of the basement was a trim shop.
Okay.
And they kept the accessories down at that end of the building,
All right.
in the basement.
Okay.
They had radios. You'd get carloads of radios in, and heaters. And there was practically no unitizing. They just started that unitizing with just a few people.
Okay.
Then in the 30s.
All right.
And Norm Schulteis was the first unitizing foreman that I can recall.
Was that then in the
I think he,
basement
yes. And I think he worked in unitizing, and then when it grew as it came along, he was down there, worked on radios, and they used to send the orders for the accessories, separate them, send them down there, and somebody in the basement would pick these radios and heaters and steering wheels. There weren't a whole lot of accessories in those days, floor mats and some of that stuff. And then and then they put the unitizing department down there, just about in the middle of the basement, on the north side of the basement. The receiving room was in the basement. On the south side, towards the dock area where they came in down there, that was the receiving room. And then they had the heavy materials, the bumpers and the axle shafts and the axle housings and the short blocks and all that sort of thing was in the bay. And they had a little paint shop just west of the receiving doors down there in the middle of the building. There was a men's restroom there, and then there was a paint shop in there with a blower on to suck the air out, and that's where they painted the heads. Painted the heads green, and different things were painted or sprayed with a preservative. And then at the extreme west end of the basement was the box shop. They stored their lumber. At the west end of the basement, they had a box shop down there. They had an elevator in the middle of the building on the south side, and they had an elevator at the end of the building on the northwest corner of the building. Ran right back of the cash sales office there. And they had a straw room, they called it. They kept straw down there for packing. They had bales of straw.
Oh, really? That's what's used for packing material?
Yeah, they had straw in there for a long time, in there. Kept that separate. Always bothered the rats. Always getting a bunch of rats. You go in there and a rat would startle you straight around. And they had several saws down there, and they did boxing. And then most of their wood boxing was for export.
All right.
It was pretty we didn't get into corrugated. They didn't get that approved for export shipping much until way late in the 50s, probably, I think, before they ever got really into corrugated.
So you were making boxes down there?
Yeah, they made the boxes when you'd ship an axle housing or anything, and they had to make a box for it.
Okay.
And then on the second floor, from the middle of the building west was a shipping room. Okay. On the second floor, and the building east from the middle of the building, they had a general foreman's office and that there in the middle of the building against the north wall. It was bin stock, all green bins, about 9 foot high, I think they were.
Small parts, kind of?
Yeah, small parts. Had individual bin sections and trays, all movable. You could move the trays up and down the floors, the pans up and
Broadbent of 7578 West Saginaw, Lansing, Michigan. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw of the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River on October 12th, 1990. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes. Okay.
This bin building was a job in itself. Every year you had, when the new models came in, they used to back up, shorten, make the bins smaller. Maybe the sales would drop down, or you'd gotten some empty bins in there. They'd scrap out, and they would back this entire affair up. You looking back at it, that was the silliest thing that you can imagine anybody.
Shuffle everything?
Everything moved back. You'd take all the empties out then, and you'd start and move the first and squeeze it together.
Yeah.
Right, in order, numerical sequence. Everything was in. Otherwise, you couldn't find anything because they didn't. Maybe they didn't have the equipment in the office to put a location on a part. So it come down, and the older guys knew the parts, the whole building, by heart. They knew where everything was that wasn't in that, but in that numerical sequence. The small parts were all numerical sequence. You imagine the job of squeezing the air out of the bin, so to speak, and backing everything up, to start over here and add to the numeric. And then it didn't come in all the same. You never really had a listing. If they did give you a complete listing of the new parts released, because like the numbers in chassis parts maybe were 405 in the 405 6-digit 405 910, 405 912, 405 918 there, and then it went to 406 220 and 407 408. That's the way the parts in Fisher Body was 7 digits. They'd start out with a 406 8211 there, 407 9410.
And you had to get those all.
And they put them in order. They put them all in numerical sequence through there. Tremendous job. Well, I don't know whose idea was, but Ken Mix was the assistant manager at that time. And he came up with the idea, and whether it was because they had equipment that could do it or not, because it seems inconceivable to me that somebody wouldn't have thought of this earlier, to put the number, just put a part in wherever there was a hole. And then he numbered these individual sections. They were 3 foot wide and 9 foot high. And he numbered them like 1, 2, 3, 4, and just through the whole stock room. And maybe it's 110 down there at the end. And you just put it in, and you'd turn in a parts notification or location tag that went to the office, and would go up there, and you had a double tag. One was just like we had in storage in later years. You had a double tag. One went in the computer, and one went into a file at the clerk's office out in the storage area. And then you just put them in wherever there was a hole, and it would tell this part was in section 1 of bin 411, the other one was in 910, and this or there.
They didn't care.
And they would print them in sequence, so a guy picking them would go to with the first one, and then as he worked through the stock room, he'd picking his parts in order, which simplified that job tremendously.
So he really picked by bin number rather than by part number.
Picked by bin number then, which made it so simple. And did away with all that, normally the bin building. Occasionally, that bin building was a nice job. You had a little wrench that fit the little square head, little 1/4-inch screws with a square head on there, and a little bin wrench, they call them. They made them out of tubing. Take a 1/2-inch tubing and flatten them square on the end that fit these wrenches. And I like that bin job. You had a feeling of accomplishment when you built something. It feels different than if you just move something around where you really can step back and see a whole section. I kind of enjoyed that when I was a material handler. That bin built. It wasn't as.
But that job went away.
Yeah, that job disappeared.
Interesting.
And it should have.
Okay,
So,
well, what else? Was anything else then on the second floor ward?
Well, you had the shipping room. You had your bin stock, the bins,
That was it.
small stock. And then on the 3rd floor, that was a bulk area. That's where you kept your fenders, or the immediate fenders you were using until it got to where you haul in the big shipments. But dealer orders, dealers come in. We kept some of everything in the 3rd floor.
Okay.
And you had quarter panels up there, and you
So it
had
was
your
all
door.
sheet metal.
One side, the whole thing was sheet metal for a while, and then they put bins up there. They had some additional bins. In fact, I was foreman up there at the time, and we had to clean out a section. They got rid of some stock and moved it to one of these storage areas, and we put more bins up in there.
The same kind of bins like you had on the second floor.
And then they got all this sheet metal out of there as they got these storage areas. The sheet metal and the fenders and that all moved out of there at the last. And
Was the paint shop still there?
the paint shop was still there. It stayed. It never did change.
It never moved.
And then they put silver baskets. Those 4-foot square baskets,
yes,
I don't think they're really 4 foot, but they're
about
3.5
that size.
Close, 3.5. That's collapsible silver baskets. And Ken Mix was the manager all through that period. Carl Brandel was, and Ken was great on new ideas.
Okay.
He was a hands-on manager.
Yeah.
He knew every damn thing that was going on in that plant, and he made periodic. He was out there as much as the general foreman some days. We get out of the office. He wanted to see everything firsthand.
Yeah.
And he was really a hands-on manager, which was entirely different from Carl Brandel.
Well,
Carl was hands-off, I guess. He very rarely went down to in the plant. Very rare to see Carl Brandel in the plant. You wouldn't see him for a week or more, and then you'd see him come. You walk through the plant. He had a private garage down in the back there that he used it was an underground under the dock. There was an area under the dock with a door, and he parked his car in there, and he'd come through about 8:15. He never started work till about 8:15, 8:30. He'd park his car downstairs and walk up the stairs and go through the stock room, and that's the only time I'd ever see him.
Would he say anything to people?
Oh, just good morning. He was very, what's it, taciturn? Is that the proper way to pronounce that? Or I don't use that word very often, but he very quiet individual, and not a fella that you could ever feel other than calling him Mister. He wasn't a guy, even when I was a foreman, I never referred to him as anything but Mr. Brandel. And he did once, I remember he said, "Oh, call me Carl," or something. Well, I just didn't feel right. I'd started in there at 18 years old, and he was the man.
Yeah, sure.
And he was not a easy, hail, well met, or whatever they call it type of guy. He was very quiet. He's kind of a large, imposing man, and he just wasn't the kind of fella you'd want to call by his first name.
Now, was Ken Mix there when you came?
Yes.
Okay. And at that point, he was
He came from purchasing.
Was he an assistant
manager? They brought him over. He was a buyer during the war. He was an office. He was supervisor in the parts, I think, prior to the war. And in the office, they had a group, material control group, I think. And then during the war, he was over in, went to in purchasing or whatnot. And then he came back and was assistant manager.
All right.
And,
so
they only had one general foreman. That was Glenn Wakeman.
that was for the whole.
Yeah, the whole place. He was really overworked. Glenn Wakeman was a hard worker, very serious, never a joke, always busy. And he just went from the general foreman's office to Mr. Brandel's office and kept Mr. Brandel apprised of what was going on. And Carl just never came out of that office unless there was something unusual he wanted to go down and look at or something. Where Ken Mix, when he came over, and Carl really wasn't on top of news things because he never got out and to see him. And Ken was great to go to other places and that he'd heard they had this or heard that, and then salesmen through purchasing. He knew all these salesmen. And you get most of your ideas from salesmen.
Sure.
They've got a new product or they see a need for a product. They come in to sell it. Looks good, you buy it. So Ken went into silver baskets, collapsible baskets. He went into green folding racks. We always had those in a budget to buy another 1,000 or 2,000 those green folding racks. And he was out there seeing what was going on every damn day.
Now, was Ken more of a personable sort of person then?
Oh yeah. He was a more friendly type of guy. He liked to kid and joke, but he was a hard man to work for. I mean hard in the sense that you had to do your job, or boy, he just chew you out up one side and down the other. He was feared by many people, including myself.
But he wasn't a Jekyll Hyde sort of.
No. He would forget it. He would just you'd do some damn fool thing, which I guess all of us do once in a while, see. Or maybe you might still think it was the right thing to do, but he didn't. And boy, would he ream me out. Most of the employees were really afraid of Ken Mix. But he would just chew me out. I probably got chewed more than anybody else because I think
you were close to him.
He kept thinking I know he did, that I could do better, and he wanted to see me do the best I very could. And I think he made me a lot better person, supervisor, if I hadn't worked for him. But the next day, all was forgotten. He didn't hold a grudge. You know, I'd be so damn mad he'd just walk away, because I had kind of a short fuse too. And every once in a while, when I thought I was just getting more than I deserved, I'd fire right back at him and tell him, get the hell out of here. I remember one time he came out inventory time. Boy, was busy. And he said, want this? Come look, I want to show you this. He'd haul me over there and show me that. I was a foreman and now I want to do that or something. Finally I said, Jesus Christ, you know, you get the hell out of here and let me do it, and I'll get it done, you know. And he just wheeled around and walked out of there. He was madder than hell. He never said another word, but next day all was forgiven. He was that kind of guy. I have a great deal of respect for him. In fact, I was pallbearer at his funeral, and I was honored that his daughter would think of me, but I kept in touch with him after he left the warehouse. But he was the smartest guy that I ever had an occasion to work with. I mean, he really knew much more than I did about the business. He was a lot better manager than I ever was, in my opinion. I think he was great myself. You know, I wished he wasn't so damn tough on people. He really went overboard on some of that. He had people very much afraid of him, girls and people worked in the office and that, but boy, he had the ideas. He really was responsible for most all the innovations that went into that warehouse through a long period of time there.
Well, that's good.
Long period of time.
Well, I'll go back to
the building.
When we moved into the new building, right?
I had the responsibility then of moving the office, the files and whatnot. In fact, I went over there. In those days, you didn't get a lot of overtime or anything. I just went in Saturdays and Sundays on my own time because it had to be done, and it was easier for me to go in and arrange things on a Saturday or Sunday so that when people came in on Monday, we wouldn't have that terrible disorganization. Where the hell was this? Where is that? So you really didn't think anything of it. It was just it went with the job. You call it casual overtime or whatever you want. I worked a lot of Saturdays and Sundays on my own time. Nobody there. I'd go in and get caught up on things that I just couldn't get caught up on, and just get so that when Monday came, I was in a position to do a hell of a lot better job than I did during the week. But we moved.
You remember when we did that? I was trying to remember back.
59. Right around Christmas time, right after Christmas, first week in January in 59, I think. It was some date like January 12th we had to move. In what department does that? Moves you, the maintenance or?
Yeah, the plant engineering.
Plant engineering department. They moved all the files over there and brought them in, and I had to rearrange them. They get all mixed up. They took them in sections. So I went in there on a Saturday, and there was a couple of Saturdays there where I brought in a girl, the file that handled the files, and these women were very helpful to me, the women in the parts, when I went from foreman to office manager there, as far as teaching me. I worked in material control. I didn't have anything to do with the order department when I was up in the office for a couple of years, and so they were a big help to me. They bailed me out of trouble in that office manager's job more than once. So I owe a lot to the people I worked with up there. Well, we got the files moved over there, and then they were moving bins.
This is out in the storage area now.
Yeah. Jim Werner, the general foreman, he was a hard-working individual and knew his business. And Jim had, and Al Stockel was general foreman out there, and the general foreman took care of the moving everything out there. And it wasn't until, I can't think who retired. Somebody retired there and left an opening and I got the general foreman's job.
That's when you went to dual-purpose job?
Yeah, that's when I kept the job. I kept the job I had, and added the general foreman's job to it.
You remember, Ward, how did we start that move? Did we start at one end of the building and go one way or the other, or do you remember?
Well, I think they moved the F material, what they called factory material. See, there's classifications on parts. The warehouses were set up. They even had classifications where the small warehouses were Z, zone warehouses. Okay. The larger warehouses were M warehouses, and they were master warehouses. Okay. And then they had a few, oh golly, it's been a long time, but they had about 4 or 5 extra large warehouses out in the field, and I can't think of the classification on that now. Okay. The Z warehouses just kept the fastest moving parts. Yeah. Parts that sold, maybe more than a couple thousand or 5,000 pieces a year. Yeah. They had it was based on sales. Yeah. Your M warehouses kept everything it was in there that sold maybe more than 500 or 1,000 pieces.
Medium.
Yeah, they classified them according to sales, and they were classified when product engineering released the part. Okay. They said a copy of the release to the parts department, and a copy to the purchasing department, and the parts man had to decide how many to order, and he did that based on what that similar part did on the year before, or a 10-year period. Yeah. If it was camshafts, you might take a 10-year period, and you knew how many cars were built in 1940, 41, or whatever, 50 or 60, whatever, and you knew how many cams you'd sold in 10 years. For that particular model, it sold 200,000-300,000 cars, you sold X number of cams. Well, that gave you a pretty good idea how many camshafts to order to start you off, and how to classify it. You could classify it as a Z part right then, or M or an L.
Now, when did all of those, this is a little off the new warehouse, but when did all those kinds of warehouses come to pass? If during the 30s we were all back in Lansing, so to speak.
Well, they had those warehouses as long as I can remember. We were making warehouse shipments. They had that field. So there were those separate warehouses from Lansing even in the 30s? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have anything to do with any of those warehouses. Chevrolet handled all those warehouses. Okay. But we would ship our parts to them if they wanted to... We had weekly shipments. Every week we made a shipment to each one of those warehouses based on on sales. They came in with their orders to us, and went up in the office up there, and then we shipped out. Like Great Falls, Montana was a Z warehouse. Okay. They just had small, maybe 15, 18 people up in Great Falls. Yeah. Salt Lake City was a Z warehouse. They had 22 people, so I went there one time. 22 people in Salt Lake, and they had 42 warehouses in all. Okay. And throughout the whole corporation. Right. And Bloomfield was a big one. Los Angeles was a big one. I think and Dallas was a big one, and I can't think of that classification right now. But they had about 4 of them that were almost carried everything except F parts. Now F stood for factory. Yeah. Sales of less than 200 a year. Okay. Fisher body parts. Yeah. Rear window molding for a 98 for 19. That you might sell 2 of. 75, 98 or something. You sold 18 of them. The first year it was out, and you know it's going to drop to about 9 the next year, and 3 the next, and after that you never sell one. Right. And then that's when they had to get realistic and scrap the damn part out. Right. So, you had all these classifications. You made a weekly shipment to them. You had carload shipments going out of the warehouse and rail. And they ordered things. Rail and truck. From you guys, in essence, they would send you orders. And we made it. It was on a different type of order, of course. The dealers were car and op orders. Pink order and a white order was in a big, about 20 items on a page there, and there'd be some of them. They'd be that thick of pages. You'd have 2 or 3 carloads going to Bloomfield. Okay. Maybe you'd have a lot of sheet metal. Maybe a couple cars of sheet metal, and then you'd have carloads of parts. Did you respond to those so-called car and op orders different than you did to? Oh, you had to try to get them out same day. So we made an effort to get every car out. Yeah. They counted lines, how many lines, like 4 items on an order was 4 lines. Mm-hmm. And that's the way the time standards are set up for picking and packing. It's how many lines a picker would pick in a day and how many lines a packer would pack. And then weight on your receiving and on your shipping, that was determined by weight. Your time standards were by how much weight you shipped. So the standards department, I can't remember just when. I know the standards department was in there when I was a foreman. When I first went down as a foreman in the shipping room. It was my first job as a foreman in the shipping room in 1950. And we had work standards then.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. A fellow named Joe Deeb and a fellow named Nichols used to come over there on standards, and yeah, those names slip my mind now. But they would check, they would study individual packers along the line on just on how long it took them, and then took them to pack so many lines, and then you came up with a standard that they had to pack 150 lines a day, and which took in some days they didn't make it, other days they should make more, depending on the material. If a guy had difficult material to pack and count and that sort of thing, because you had counters and packers down there. You had a fellow that checked it off the picking trucks onto the packer station, and then the packer took it out of bins and packed it in packages and shipped it down a conveyor line. The scale man weighed it.
Now, was this in '62? Did you have that?
Yeah.
Or was this out?
Oh yeah, we had that in '62, and we duplicated on a larger scale in the new building.
Now that was down at the dock area. Is that where that was in '62?
The car knob shipping was just past the firewall in the center, just to the north of the firewall there. They had the bin section, what they called the F bins, where about that first 10 bays or so north of the firewall. The inspection department was just beside the receiving department, just on the other side of the firewall from the receiving department of the dock. And then you had the F area ran down as far as unitizing. Then the unitizing picked up down there in the middle of the building, the middle of the north end of the building, and ran down there about 5 bays, maybe 5, 6 bays, and then the width of the building there, and then the storage area was down there. Now when they put the other addition on, that was all mostly sheet metal storage, and well, they had bins. They had some drywall storage in there too.
Now you had a little Bondurite.
Bondurite and Prime took up the first 15 bays.
Now that was a different thing than you had over in the old building.
Well, that was a production thing then. That we ran, I don't know how many 100 Defenders a day there in hoods and metal finish. We had in 7 or 8 metal finishers. We had 3 or 4 welders. We had gun welders. We had about 6 or 8 gun welders in there. We had an arc welder, and we had a paint spray booth. They had a problem with 59 and 60 fenders. Those fenders were a big fender, and they had a sharp nose that came back, and it rusted out in that nose. And they had a lot of complaints and a lot of replacement fenders on that 59 and 60. I remember because that's when I first, about the time I took over that sheet metal. So they put in quite an expansive one-man spray booth about just at the start of the line, as these parts before they went up into through the bond riders, or after. I guess they came out of the wash. I forget. I know where it was, but I'm trying to think at what point they did it. But they had a guy with a spray gun in there spraying the nose of that with anti-corrosion paint.
I'll be darned.
Just on those jobs.
At the front end of those 50,
an air gun there. And then they went through the bonderizer and the wash, and from the bonderizer they went through the paint, and they had the oven on the roof. And they came out of the oven and came back down, and we had banding machines set up there, 2 or 3 banding machines, and we wrapped that material right as it moved on the line, which was a nice operation.
So the ammo roof system disappeared.
That disappeared. We did keep a small paint booth down there towards the end of the paint area, against the wall, against that which was then the east wall, and we sprayed blocks and little brake drums or something or whatever, some heavy stuff came in there. I can't remember all what they did in there. and sprayed them, and then some of them they'd put some anti-rust like WD-40 or something like that, spraying something like that on them rather than paint for storage.
Okay.
So, and that was a one-man operation.
Yeah.
One guy in there.
So when you ended up being the general foreman and the office manager, where was your office at that time?
Right when I was general, I was still kept that same office. I had an office up there just to the right of the lobby.
Okay.
And the manager and the assistant manager was over there at the west side of the office.
Okay. So Ken sat right there in back of the big stone wall.
Yeah, he sat in back stone wall, and then the secretary's area in between. The assistant manager was over against the wall leading out into the parts where those double doors were.
Now, was that assistant manager, was that a position that had existed back when you were in 62?
It hadn't, there was no assistant manager until Ken Mix came over.
Okay, so he was the first assistant manager.
Yes.
And
yeah, Miles Church was the office manager. They really needed an assistant manager at that point, but, shut that off.
Okay. So when did Ken come then? He came sometime around the war?
Well, he came in after the war was over.
Okay.
He'd gone to purchasing. He got a better job, as I understand it. Now, I wasn't there at that time.
I appreciate that.
But Ken was a supervisor in the office, in the parts office, and when the war came along, he had an opportunity to go into purchasing. And so he was in charge of buying all the service parts at that time. And so then after the war started, then the parts business was getting where I'm sure that management felt was more than Carl Brandel, a one-man operation at that point. So they sent Ken over there as assistant manager.
Okay, so that's when he arrived. Now you got kind of a manager and an assistant manager.
Right, and that's where they got, I don't know why the warehouses always had assistant managers, and in other places they were superintendents or assistant superintendents, something, a different name. So Carl retired, I think, in '56.
Okay.
And Ken became manager in '56, and at that time, Harold Van Elps, who was out of a job, so to speak. Harold had been a crib attendant in the jet plant, and had been then made general foreman over they had some cribs over there, and then they made him assistant production manager. Over there, which actually he had nothing to do with production. I guess it was just seeing the guy had racks and guns and material. So that job had ended, so Harold was more or less floating over there, and they were finding a job for him. So he came over to the parts as assistant manager.
Okay, now that's the first time he'd ever been in the parts business.
I was foreman at the time. I remember when he came over, and so he had to start from scratch on learning the business, so that's how Harold ended up over there. So then Ken retired in '66, and Harold became manager in '66, and I became assistant manager.
Okay, so now you guys were out at the new place, so.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it was Mix and then the secretary and then Harold Van Epps from an office standpoint on that.
Right, on that west wall. West wall.
Okay. So then Mix left in '66, and Van Epps moved into his job, and then you moved into Van Epps's job.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's good to see.
So that was the status quo until 1970.
All right.
And then in '70, we became part of GMPD.
Okay. Now, prior to that point in time, you were still working, quote, for Oldsmobile.
Yes.
Part of Oldsmobile organization.
Bob Cook was production manager, at least at the start of that time.
All right.
And Vic Federoff was his assistant. Ray Federoff was his assistant.
Okay. And you fellows worked for Federoff, did you, or did you work for Cook?
No, well, Ray and Cook. I mean, there was a very small distinction. One time, Cook would call you about something or come over and check an operation. Another time Vic would drop in, so you really felt you had two bosses. I didn't make any distinction. Whatever either one of them wanted was what they got.
Okay.
I guess that's the way it works.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so then, cover, how did the GMPD thing come to happen?
I really don't know. I'd heard a little scuttlebutt about it, that they were considering forming one division in the sake of efficiency and make one purchasing group there, because I'm sure we were duplicating
Okay.
I think that forming the General Motors Parts Division was a good move,
Okay.
as far as for the benefit of your customers and dealers, better service and better control, inventory control, which is where your dollars lie.
Sure.
So I saw nothing wrong with that, although I didn't enjoy working for someone that is in 50 miles away compared to being able to pick up the phone, and have a face-to-face conference discussion about something there when you're working in your own plant. It was difficult, quite difficult at first to get used to, and a lot of duplication of effort there to start with, and it was a different type of management.
Yeah.
They managed the GMPD, the managers in their warehouses and that sat in the office. I don't think some of them ever went in the plant more than once a month.
Oh my
If they went that. They had superintendents. They didn't have an assistant manager. They eliminated. They never did have with the warehouses. They made those assistant managers all superintendents.
Okay.
And then they had some economy things came in at that time. They took the company cars away from all the assistant managers or former assistant managers, or they kept them on a grandfather clause.
Yeah.
If you were an assistant, you still kept your car, but if you were promoted then to assistant, you didn't get a company car.
Interesting.
So they cut their company car fleet in about half or more by then. And they wouldn't sell. One thing I didn't like about them, at Oldsmobile, we sold our company cars.
Sure.
We satisfied a lot of people. We had a good employee relationship there, and General Motors Parts Division did not have that type of relationship. They did not have, there was a very strong division between salary and hourly.
Interesting.
If you walked through the Chevrolet warehouse, not one hourly person would speak to you.
Oh my Lord. It wasn't one happy family like
Not,
here.
no, it was a very strong division there, in the same way in some of the other GM plants there, but mainly in Chevrolet. Chevrolet, one thing that surprised Chevrolet people, management that came over there, was the relationship that the salary had, the management had with the employees.
Yeah.
I could walk down through the plant, and every man I passed says, "Hi, Ward, how are you?" or whatever, and I knew I probably knew 90% of the names of the 500 or so people who were working there, and made a point of calling them by name. But in Chevrolet, they didn't do that. They couldn't understand it. It was just amazing. They commented on it. They couldn't figure on it. They, in fact, at one time, before I retired, a couple years before I retired, they came and sounded me out about moving to Chevrolet. They didn't make a direct offer in that sense at that point. They never do. But they wanted to know if I'd like to go, if I'd be willing to go to Chevrolet if the job was offered, is the way they put it. And at that time, it would have, financially, probably they had 1,700 people over there compared to our 500, which would have probably been a step in the right direction if I'd wanted to continue on in my job or in my work, and that. But one of the things that they mentioned was they thought they'd like to get someone in there that could build a better relationship. There was such a friction and hostility between hourly and salary that they thought maybe that a new change, if somebody coming from Oldsmobile could bring some of those. I don't know if we had any ideas. They were just, I always felt they were saying, God, I was an hourly man for 10 years.
We treated everybody.
Yeah, so I didn't know it wasn't singular to the parts. It was all over the plant. Everybody, you could stop and talk to a superintendent in the plant or whatever, but they didn't do that in AAA. Very strange. It was.
Then, see, that all happened in 70, was it?
Yes. In 70, Harold, GMPD took over that, but just before they did, we had the best record of all the car factories in shipments on time, the condition of the shipment, the way we did our loading and packaging, just about every facet of the parts business, we were doing a better job. Our material handling costs were much lower than the other plants. And we were just sitting on #1. So Harold was the manager, and they thought Harold was going to be just the man they wanted for their Martinsburg plant, which was a much larger plant. I've been to Martinsburg. It is a beautiful, huge plant. Had your own computers office and did their payroll and everything there. It was a complete plant. And they thought Harold would be the fellow to go down there and run that Martinsburg plant. They had the manager there. They had promoted him to, they created a lot of new jobs, and he was director of the car factories. They also had a director made of all the fields. So they had 2 directors. They had a general director, Scotty Foster was the general director. He came from Delco or someplace, AC or something. It was sales down there. It had nothing to do with warehousing. It was pretty obvious. But Harold ran into problems down there after he got away from Oldsmobile. It was probably a new, complete different ball of wax. And
new guys.
And he had his problems, and so he ended up leaving, or this was after, but he left to get back to where we were. When he left the plant, then they appointed me as manager of the plant, plant manager.
So now you would then had the whole plant.
So then I had the whole plant.
Now was there an assistant at that point in time?
There was for a while, and it was the same. Ernest Kowalski was a general foreman, and he was promoted to assistant manager, and then they changed his classification in GMPD to superintendent. I think that probably wasn't a bad move on the overall, looking over all their plants, rather than tag somebody at the start as assistant manager. They could call them, so many of these places had, later in the bigger plants, like they had 2 or 3 superintendents. They had 1 manager and they had 3 superintendents.
All reported
By calling them superintendents, then you had a choice if you wanted to say, or bring somebody in from outside as manager, as manager, rather than pre-tag him as assistant, and wish to God you had another guy that you said, you know. So I think that was a wise move. I wouldn't quarrel with that. But they were on economy moves, and that was after in 71, 72, everything was cut this, cut that, eliminate this, eliminate that. And they ran the plant on paper. At Oldsmobile, I'd have a stack of paper as a manager there, or assistant manager, maybe a ½ inch. It would accumulate, because I spent a lot of time. I like to be out on the floor. I guess I was a hands-on manager. I wanted to get out. I wanted to see what was going on, and then I'd know. I didn't want somebody coming in telling me that we were doing this and that. I wanted to go out, see what we were doing, how it was doing, have a hand in determining how we were going to do it. And I could do that. I could come back after the plant went home at 3:30, and I could clean up all my paperwork, answer some letters or anything I had, and make some phone calls or something, and go home. Go home at 5:30. I wasn't the first guy out the door, never was, or the last guy in or anything, but I'd go home at a reasonable hour. When the GMPD took over, it was nothing to have a stack like that. And all wanting, will you give us, and I had a fellow that was my boss over there, was a workaholic. He was known all over the GM. I heard a lot of scuttlebutt after I had people calling me on the phone from warehouses saying that I was going to be one sorry son of a gun for this guy. Well, and I was. But he would send memorandums after memorandums over to me. Would you give me I would like the total of the number of fenders you built each year of each model from 1959 or something, or not then, maybe 1965 through 1970. Well, for a long time before I was assistant manager, I was the office general supervisor. I had the whole office. I'd had the office for 3 or 4 years over in the old plant, moved everything over. Nobody really knew where a lot of that stuff was, you know.
Yeah, because it was ancient history.
It was ancient history, see. And I didn't have anybody that, in Chevrolet, they seemed to have clerks floating around that weren't assigned. Because I know the Marv Shapiro, whom I liked and admired, he became the director later on. Was my boss. He was manager at Pontiac, and plant manager at Pontiac. And I lost my train of thought there for a minute. Oh, he'd say when the budget came up, we'd talk about the budget. Now, Ken Mix always did the budget. When Harold Van Epps was manager, Harold and I did the budget, worked together on the budget. And so when I became manager, I took over the budget. Ernie Kowalski hadn't been in the office and had that office end of the job there, and so he really didn't know anything about it. And we'd never had a 5-level clerk or 4-level clerk just floating around. Everybody had a full-time job.
Sure.
In these places, and I know Marv told me, Shapiro said, oh, over to Pontiac, I just put a 5-level clerk, just assigned him to it, and he did all the budget work. I said, how do you have time to? Oh, well, that's all. We just put him on that full time. He said he just worked with the budget department and got the budget off. He says, you get one of your guys in the office to do that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You can't get one of those guys. Every guy out there had a full-time job. I even was using my lobby girl to type bills of lading. She didn't have any idle time. She didn't sit there in the lobby and book salesmen in. We didn't get too many. She was typing bills of lading for the traffic department because they couldn't keep up with the shipment. You didn't have anybody. Hell, I was working Saturday and Sundays on these things, see? So that was some of the things you had to do with this terrible amount of paperwork. I was the only one that knew where anything was stored, because I had to put it all away and file that stuff, and so I had to come in and do that myself. I didn't do the typing up or any of that kind of crap, but I mean, I had to get all this information. I find that they just about drove me crazy there that first 6 months. Finally, I wrote a letter to this director, and I asked, you couldn't hire anybody. I asked for, I wanted to hire a 4-level clerk. I said, we just have got so much work in here. So many people are asking for information. Traffic department over there, send you memo. Would you tell us how many shipments? And, this, and you didn't. Foremen were all busy. I mean, I didn't try to run everything myself, but who the hell are you going to give all this work to? You haven't got it. And I said I just needed someone to work in the 5-level, say, to work in the office that could handle some of this request for information and and all this transfer stuff. So they called me over at the office, and my boss was really the biggest offender of this. And of course, everybody in the plant knew it. See, who's sitting in the meeting with the general director? The 2 or 3 of us. See. Well, what's the problem? I said, I'm getting all this information, but have somebody do it and all this and that. And I said, we don't have anybody that doesn't have a job. I said, no, I'm sure that there's some divisions that have people kind of floating around, and anytime they need it, they've got a guy that's got about a half a job that they put on that. And I said, we don't seem to have that over there. I said, everybody, Ken Mix was tough on that, you know. I'd learned under Hard Taskmaster. You didn't have anybody that didn't have a 8-hour job. You see some guy sitting back in the chair looking out the window, and that guy had that was the end of that. Either that guy had something else to do, or you got rid of him. See, if you don't need him, if you don't have anything to do. So about a week after that meeting, I get a letter. They've enrolled me in a class at the University of Michigan for a week on delegation, how to delegate responsibility. See, Jesus, that pissed me off. I was really steamed at that, let me tell you. So when that guy retired, this Foster guy retired, they called up in personnel department and wanted, it was $12 a ticket or something. You're going to have a dinner for him and a gift. And I said, no, I'm not going. I was still manager there.
You hardly knew the guy anyway,
yeah.
Really.
And I said, I'm not going. Well, everybody's going. I said, no, they're not. And he says, they're not? And I said, no, because I'm not. And he says, well, do you want to give the gift? I says, hell no, I don't want to give the gift. I said, that guy's made more money than he's worth ever since I've known him. I said, they're going to buy him a garden tractor. I said, let him buy his own garden tractor, see.
That's his gift.
So that probably didn't set very good with anybody. But I was the only guy that didn't go. And it happened that they had a big meeting at Weber's. And they were always going someplace for a meeting, down to Chicago or Baltimore, and with the plant managers and having a meeting. I don't know, they had to get out of town have a meeting. They had it down there, and that was the night they had the party for this guy. I was the only guy that didn't go. Everybody else went. All these others. It was kind of embarrassing at the time because I didn't. I just thought it was something I wouldn't have to drive to Flint to go. But that guy was a sales guy, somebody in sales from one of these small divisions, and got to be director over there, and he didn't know beans. He'd come in and look all through the plant and everything coming out, and he said, you know, real serious. You know, he said, down there in that one area where those silver baskets are, he says, you got one row of those baskets. He says, boy, that needs straightening up. I said, well, I'll get right on it. You know.
Big help.
Big help. Yeah, that was kind of an experience getting with that outfit. But I finally got out of there anyway.
When did you retire then, Lord?
74, when that big group left in 74. They had a little inducement there. They gave you a few $100 more on the pension till you got 62. I was only 56 when I retired. Well, I was 56 when I retired, and then I was 57 about a month later after I retired. It was in April 1st, I think, of 74. So I've been out a long time.
Long time, yeah. Well, you were there when they made the switch then.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Then they brought in somebody from to take my job, the guy out of the personnel department over there, Irv Mollering. He was assistant personnel manager, and they made him
from Flint.
From Flint. Yeah. So I don't know much. I've never been back since I left, so I don't know what's going on over there.
Can you maybe over that long continuum of time that you've seen, maybe you could share with us what changes you might have seen in the management style of folks? Did it change at all in all that time?
I think General Motors Parts Division was probably the biggest change in management in there, although there were different personalities.
Maybe set that aside and just think about it during the Oldsmobile times that you were there. Did the method of management change much, how we ran the railroad, so to speak?
No, I didn't really, there's a difference in people as managers, but the system itself was the same, and we had a marvelous relationship. I didn't realize what kind of relationship we had with our people at Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile was really, you were proud to work at Oldsmobile. I never knew anyone in the old days that wasn't proud to work at Oldsmobile. You'd hear some guy telling how he told the foreman off or this and that, but underneath he wanted everybody to know he worked at Oldsmobile. You go out of town someplace in the old days, and you were glad to tell somebody, oh, I work at Oldsmobile. Oh, you do, you know? And it was even a 54-cent an hour job was a premium job, at least in my opinion.
Well, what do you attribute that to? How did that come to pass?
I don't know, but I'll tell you, in that Oldsmaker book, page letter I gave you in that shop magazine, C.L. McEwen's a manager, and he's got a column in there, and I read it before I brought that over to you. I really hadn't read it to that extent. I was looking at it. It's about pride in Oldsmobile and pride in the work and how Oldsmobile should treat people. How they should treat their suppliers. And you should read that. It says a lot, I thought then, that says a lot about just what Oldsmobile stood for. At least before the big breakup. And I don't really know anything about that, so I'm not qualified to comment on that. But there is different. You talk to people different. Since you don't have the same feeling that they did when Oldsmobile was an entity in itself. And you really took pride in the Oldsmobile 88. They didn't make a better car in the world than the Oldsmobile 88 and 98s or whatever, 66 or 68 or what, all those models we had. Boy, that's the only car anybody ever wanted, and that's all anybody ever bought that worked at Oldsmobile. You wouldn't think of buying another car. Now you see people driving all kinds of cars. There's more foreign cars. When the Volkswagens first came in, boy, they were poisoning the parking lot. And my God, now I imagine the head of the UAW is driving a Mazda or something, for all we know.
How about over that continuum, union relations? Did you see any change in that?
Oh, well, the union got stronger and more demanding than it used to be, which I was never against the union. I never had any strong feelings against the union that they shouldn't be. I think they were great. I worked as hourly from 1935 to 1948, and I had 3 of those years in the Army, but I had 10 years hourly, and I had never had a quarrel with a foreman, never had an argument, never said, oh, I wished I could quit or anything. I never had that feeling. I was always treated well, but still, I could see where the union helped a lot of people. I was fortunate in working in a low-pressure department. I imagine there were a lot of inequities in production jobs where the difference in your job made a difference whether you went home all wore out or whether you went home feeling pretty well. You know, foreman's favorites and that sort of thing. And men, I've known of men that were fired in the old days for practically nothing at all. Somebody just wanted to get his friend a job, and so I think the union should have been there. You know, I really think they did a good job, and they got more responsible after that. First through the 30s and 40s, they were pretty irresponsible, and now they're more responsible than they ever were, because they really ran wages up to the point where the Japanese have captured our market, and they got away from the employee pride. They kept a lot of employees they shouldn't have been, would never have stuck, or at least they'd have been different people if they'd stuck. You could see that plainly. I never had any hard feelings against. I got along well with all the union people. It worked, at least I think it did. And in fact, my wife and I had lunch the other week over at Hoffman House. There we go in there occasionally for lunch. I like that salad bar. And I ran into 2 guys from the plant, Whitey Fisher and the other fellow. I knew him, but I couldn't think of his name, Davis. I forgot his first name already, but Whitey Fisher was a truck driver over there, and he got into the union, and he's been in the union, kind of one of the union officials in 1753 there, and they evidently had some kind of a union meeting, because there was a couple other fellows showed up with UAW jackets. I think they had a ratification meeting, and probably rented a room at Marriott. Is that the Marriott there? I don't know what hotel it is there. That the Hoffman House is in, I forget now, but they evidently, so I went over and visited with them. They appeared to be glad to see me, and I met a couple of the other people there with them, and visited quite a while. While my wife and I were waiting for the check, I went over there and talked to them. And I was tickled to see them. But we had that kind of relationship. Anybody, I don't know anybody that works at the plant that if I ran into them, I wouldn't be glad to see them or have them stop at the house or anything. I know one fellow stopped at one fellow when I was first foreman. He was kind of belligerent guy, big husky guy, and I wanted him to do something, and he said, oh, he had something else he was going to do, and it got to a confrontation. I sent him home. Told him to punch out and go home. Well, he was going to meet me outside, you know. There was a lot of that.
Yeah,
And I said, well, I go out the west door every night, 5 o'clock, take your chances or something. Well, he never showed up. Yeah. And after that, we got along pretty well. And about a year ago, there was a knock on the door. And who would it be but this fellow? I can't think of his last name. His first name was John, and his son, and they ran out of gas right in front of my house. I live out on the highway.
Yeah.
Want to know if I had any gas? I said, sure, I've got gas. And
Did
he was
know
glad.
it was your house?
I don't know. I think he did.
Yeah.
Maybe not. But the car had stalled just
Yeah.
out in front there anyway, whether he saw the name then or not. And so he had his son with him. By then, his son's probably 20 years old. You know how time goes by. So I got him gas and told him to take whatever he needed and forget it, you know. And, oh, no, I'll pay. And I said, no, you won't. I said, just forget it. Take it. So that he wanted his son to meet me. He brought his son. I invited him in the house. They came in, sat down for a while, visited, and I couldn't help but in my mind, remember, I didn't mention it, of course, and that, and he didn't either. So when he left, he took the gas can with him. And I knew what he's up to, and I mean, I didn't notice it then. I just said, well, you know, just take whatever you want out. There's a 5-gallon can of gas. Take whatever you need, John, and forget it. Oh, no. He took the gas can down, filled it up again, brought it back. And I found it sitting outside the garage full of gas there. But I mean, we had that kind of relationship in the old days. Hell, you got a guy who was mad enough to fight there on one time, and probably 4 or 5 days later, he'd gotten all over it. He probably, maybe longer than that, because I laid him off for about 3 or 4 days. Imagine, it might have been longer. Might have been a little longer than that. But that's all forgotten. I know he was proud to work at Oldsmobile, and I'm sure I didn't know anybody that wasn't, at least that we'd want around. I don't know what's happened to it. You worked there later than I did, and I don't know what the feeling was in later years. I know I heard a lot of adverse comment about GMPD, but I think that could be just GMPD's form of management. You know, that they didn't. I don't think they got quite the feeling over there. In fact, they never see the manager over there now. They said they got a manager, but they never see him. She's got 3 superintendents. The job's a lot bigger now.
Well, the place is a lot
bigger. They got 1,000 people. The most we ever had probably was 600 or 5 something. So it's a big job now, and you can't be running around there and doing it. Maybe now you got to be a hands-off manager. Just I imagine just taking care of the paperwork, keep that guy busy. But I suppose there comes a time on any job where you just can't get out there and personally see everybody. You know, I'm sure the general manager, Bob Stemple, isn't running around to see how they're building the cars.
No, can't do that.
No.
Oh, that's great, Ward. What have we missed? Anything else?
Well, I don't know. I think you got my life history there.
Well, I don't know about that. Did a nice job for us on that activity. So.
Well, I've had a lot of pleasant memories. I have no bad memories of my work. Met a lot of nice people. Don't see many anymore, you know. When you get out of the mainstream there, you don't. And then there's a lot of them are gone now. I'm going to a funeral tomorrow morning there. One of my high school chums that I've known ever since high school, and haven't interacted socially with him after we got married so much, but I'd run into him all, and we were at the 55th reunion here just there in September, and spent several hours with him during the reunion, and they had some things going on the day after. It was one of those, maybe you read about, it had a little item in the paper where we had to go every year. We'd go down there to the Capitol steps and have a picture taken, just a small group. He was one of the group, Lee DeMott. He was manager of Morgan's, passed away, and has been sick for a long time, stomach cancer. So the ranks get a little thinner all the time.
They sure do. Well, great, Ward. I really appreciate you coming in and sharing with us that.
Well, I enjoyed it too. I guess when you talk about yourself, you know, you can't go wrong on that.
No. So I guess all I have to do is sign off on our little sheet, and I'll shut this off.